Thank you, Janice. What a brilliant way to kick off the Words Festival. Since I started working on the Words Festival with our wonderful team, one of the frequent questions that I get about the festival, particularly this year, is the question and curiosity over this term that we continue to use to describe our festival, Sowesto. And it's a question that I like most. What is Sowesto? Because if there is a word that I would use to describe words, it is Sowesto. Sowesto is an abbreviation which refers to a geographical region, southwestern Ontario, running from the Ottawa River through to the western side of Lake Superior. Lake Huron also lies on the west side of the region, and Lake Erie lies to the south. The term was coined in the 1960s by London's much-beloved artist, Greg Cournot, who used the term to crystallize his unique vision of regionalism, a vision that has enriched other perspectives on regionalism across Canada and beyond. But it was also a point of resistance to the encroaching pull of the metropolis of Ontario, namely Toronto, and the power of an influential neighbor, the United States. After the 2016 American election, one of the most persistent and powerful images I saw on social media from this area was Cournot's America. You might know this painting. A wonderfully ironic title for an imaginative work that produces a map of North America where the southern border of Canada stitches together with the northern border of Mexico. As the Canadian cultural critic Robert Fulford has noted, Greg defied the idea that art happens when artists gather in big cities and exchange ideas. Art for Greg happened in Sowesto. James Rainey, one of our most distinguished writers, shared Greg's vision. In his book of poems, Sowesto Home, and in his drama, like the Donnellys, we see a vision of Sowesto that immerses us in a literary imagination filled with the contradictions, stories, and creative power of the region. Sowesto also has its darker intrigues, like the Gothic atmospherics of Alice Munro's Small Town Jubilee. Margaret Atwood has described southwestern Ontario as a region of considerable psychic murkiness and oddity. A view shared by Robertson Davies, who probably everyone's had a chance to read, who remarked, and this is Robertson Davies, "I know the dark folkways of my people." The poetics of Sowesto penetrates down into the very geology of our region, as you can find in the geologically inspired works of Christopher Dewdney, whose father Selwyn introduced a new generation to the Indigenous pictographic art in Northern Ontario, painted in red ochre on the rocks. Indeed, the seemingly ordinary spaces and places of Sowesto have long been a source of extraordinary fascination, curiosity, and intrigue. Sowesto has another meaning for our festival, oriented towards the present and the future. It's an index of the current renaissance of literary creativity in this city. In London, there is a lively literary community with well-attended meetings of the London Poetry Slam, Poetry London, a new series called Couplets, Open Mic Poetry, the London Writers' Society, to name only a few. We have a vibrant community of writers, poets, and thinkers in this city who are enlivening our cultural life. The organizers of this festival are motivated by the belief that we as a community should celebrate and bring more visibility to this creativity and our achievements. We also acknowledge that Sowesto is located in the traditional territory of the Attawandaron neutral peoples, alongside of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. The community is the home of a diverse Indigenous population, and we reaffirm, as always, our commitment to the support of the artistic contributions of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis writers in our region and beyond. We hope that Words brings London's creativity to the world, while introducing our community to new ideas, new books, new authors. And now I would like to introduce you to our panel of 5 leading luminaries of Canadian literature and the arts. And I'll keep my bios short because we want to hear from them. So as I name, perhaps you can make your way up to the stage and grab a microphone and a stool. Claire Cameron. Claire Cameron's writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, the LA Review of Books, the Rumpus. She is a staff writer at the Millions, and her first novel, The Line Painter, won the Northern Lit Award. Her second novel, The Bear, was a national bestseller and was longlisted for the Bailey's Women's Prize of Fiction. This year, she published her third novel, The Last Neanderthal, which is currently a finalist for the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize. Steven Heighton won a Governor General's Award last year for his poetry collection, The Waking Comes Late. This year, he published a new novel, The Nightingale Won't Let You Sleep. He is also the author of the novel Afterlands, which was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, along with the Best of the Year selection in Canada, the US, and the UK. His work has been translated into 10 languages, and his poems and stories have appeared in essentially every literary periodical worth reading. Stephen Marche is the author of The Hunger of the Wolf, Love and the Mess We're In, How Shakespeare Changed Everything, Shining at the Bottom of the Sea, and Raymond and Hannah. His newest book, The Unmade Bed, The Messy Truth About Men and Women in the 21st Century, came out this year. He also writes a monthly column for Esquire. Liz Howard, her first book of poems, Infinite Citizen of the Shaking Tent, won the 2016 Griffin Poetry Prize, the first time the debut collection has won this award. Originally from Northern Ontario, Liz now works as a research officer, although she just told me that she switched positions, so my data is incorrect on this particular. But she does work on neuroscience and the aging brain. And Ron Sexsmith is a Juno Award-winning singer-songwriter whose lyrics have drawn the warm reviews of musicians like Paul McCartney, Elton John, and Elvis Costello. He has created 12 beautiful albums, and you all will probably know him from his poignant songs and distinct voice. Ron is here with us at the Words Festival on the heels of the publication of his debut book, Dear Life, spelled D-E-E-R, an adult fairy tale he wrote while on the road. Ron has recently moved to Stratford, so in keeping with the prevailing theme of the night, we can now say that he calls Sowesto home. So join me in welcoming our panel of authors. Okay, so I'd like to start off with a question to all of our panelists about their craft of writing, because there's a really unique story behind all the books that have been written by our authors on the panel. So I'll start with Claire. The Last Neanderthal, set in France 40,000 years ago, tells the incredibly well-researched and compelling tale of a Neanderthal girl named Girl, the title character, and Rose, the modern-day archaeologist who discovers her bones. And they're stitched together to tell a poignantly human story. You've described the research and the writing for this book as taking 5 years, about as long as it might take to get a PhD in archaeology or genetics. Could you talk to us a little bit about the approach that you had for the research and the writing of your book?
I'd actually settle for a BA, I think, if anyone can give me anything honorary. I read thick textbooks. I guess it started in 2010. When I'm writing fiction in the day, I like to read something that feels more certain in the evening. So I've taken to reading New Scientist magazine. And I read in there about the mapping of the Neanderthal genome. So this was the first draft in 2010, and what it said was that many of us of European and Asian descent have Neanderthal DNA. I did one of those tests, and I'm 2.5%. You can tell, maybe. But this is significant because it means that we interbred with Neanderthals. And before that, the idea of interbreeding was sort of the realm of like internet. People wrote porn on the internet. And then, there's a few sort of outlier academics who thought maybe this was true. But if we interbred with them, that meant we were very close to them. And so I wanted to write a story that told, rather than sort of hairy knuckle-dragging beasts, I wanted to tell a story that told of Neanderthals as much more human and close to us. So I thought that was only interesting if it was on this layer, if it felt plausible, if it was taking all the current research and then using that as a springboard.
Wonderful. Liz, I'm going to go out of order here, just to surprise everybody on the panel. If Claire ought to have received a degree for her work, you did receive a degree of sort, a form with your MFA. In the titles, images, figures, ideas, we can see the science training informing your poetry as well. Could you tell us a little bit about the process of writing Infinite Citizen of the Shaking Tent?
Can you hear me? Oh.
That's lovely. Yes. So in my undergraduate degree, I did a bachelor's of science, and I studied psychological science and neuroscience. I dissected an actual human brain and spinal cord, which was awesome. You know, it probably sounds like really gross, but I'm weird. I was really into stuff like that. And so many of my friends who are also poets, you know, they did a degree in literature, humanities. And so they pulled from that influence. So they had Homer and Auden and Yeats, etc. And I had, you know, Candel's Principles of Neuroscience to pull from. That was my influence.
Amazing. Stephen, in the introduction for your book, Steven Marche, you've described it as a book designed in the form of half argument, half confession, a peculiar form, to quote you. Your confessional narrative is interweaved with the revolution in gender relations taking place right now. Could you talk about some of the sparks that motivated you to write in this unique format?
Well, I mean, I think we're in this very chaotic moment when it comes to gender that I think we don't often understand very fully. Obviously, Trump has thrown this all into chaos. And, you know, I had the great misfortune to write a book about gender just before Trump was elected. But, you know, I mean, I think, to me, the thing that was sort of interesting about gender, the way to write about gender anyway, was that, you know, politics was happening and a sort of gender war was going on. At the same time, there was intimate life going on. And it was about trying to connect intimate life with the gender wars that I really found, you know, when you tried to do that in terms of writing, it became very interesting because it was simply so impossible to do. And that's why, you know, I wrote this book essentially about my marriage, really. And then I had my wife footnote it. And she sort of said, "You're wrong here." You know, like she sort of said, like, "This is where you're wrong. This is where you're wrong." And so that was kind of the format of the book. Yeah.
Yeah, buy the book for Stephen and stay for the footnotes.
The footnotes,
absolutely amazing.
Everyone says my wife's footnotes are the best part of the book, so I can't.
They're terrific.
I can't really disagree with that.
Steven Heighton, you have described the genesis of The Waking Comes Late, your recent book of poetry, as creative reveries, or a train of poetic images that would come to you in the night from your night mind, sometimes as a single line, sometimes as 10 or 15 lines. Can you speak a little bit about how poetry has become a nocturnal experience for you?
Yeah, you know, like anyone moving deeper into midlife. Is this on?
There we go.
Thanks. Like anyone, whoa! I thought turn it on too high. Like anybody moving deeper into midlife, my life's become more and more logistical and administrative. And I found increasingly that the poems that were coming to me they weren't satisfying me. They seemed to be written wholly by, you know, my prefrontal lobe. So there wasn't that X factor, that element of mystery that has to be in a good poem. Increasingly, luckily, in the last 5 years or so, poems started to come in the form of images and dreams, and I'm a light sleeper, so I'd force myself to write these things down. So it was almost as if, you know, the revenge of the night mind, the subconscious part of the mind, that wasn't allowed to write poetry anymore, didn't have the time, the leisure to enter that sort of dream state that's necessary for any writer, not just a poet, fiction writer, nonfiction writer. Whoever you are, you have to be able to enter that sort of dream state where the logistical administrative mind is not organizing everything. And increasingly, the revenge of my night mind because I wasn't writing poetry during the day, was to give me these poems. And fortunately, I was able to write them down. And increasingly, the only poems of mine that I'm happy with are the ones that come at night in the form of dreams.
It's amazing, and it's a perfect stitch over to Ron. In the preface of Dear Life, you reveal that the idea for the fairy tale came to you in a morning dream, which is often a state of consciousness or unconsciousness, I suppose, that yields melodies and lyrics for you as a songwriter and in your songwriting. Could you talk a little bit about the place of dream thoughts as a source of creativity for you?
Is my mic on?
Yeah.
You can hear that? Okay, I don't have the green light like everyone else. No, it's okay. No, as long as it's working, it's fine. Well, that was a strange thing when I got the idea, because I'd sort of, I'd gotten used to, getting these melodic ideas, not always in that, whatever you dream state or whatever, but, sometimes you'd have to get up in the middle of the night to write something down, or, so when I woke up with this idea, I knew it wasn't a song. Mm-hmm. In fact, I thought it was maybe a movie that I'd seen. It was like watching a trailer for a movie or something, And so this was back in 2012, and I didn't really know what to do with it. I thought, well, the only way I could sort of make sense of it was that it could be a good musical or something. And so I walked around, and whenever I'd run into an actor friend, I'd sort of bore them to death with, oh, what do you think of this? And I'd have this, and they were all very supportive, but then it would just sort of, the tumbleweed would roll across the room, So it wasn't until around, 2015 when a fellow at Penguin said, oh, no, that sounds like a book, you should write that book. But that's a very fertile time, though, that in the morning hours, when you don't feel like getting out of bed, so you just lie there. And I find I've come up with many song ideas during that time.
It's fascinating. I have a follow-up question, too. When you think of old-fashioned fairy tales, which is what you've described as Dear Life, I also think of the darker qualities of, say, the Brothers Grimm. There's some pretty dark moments in fairy tales, actually. There are some dark moments here in the book, too. The town and the places like Hinterhoven and Hixenbau are also, they kind of remind me of that remark of Robertson Davies, that dark folkways of Sowesto.
Hixenbau is my wife's last name, actually. I just thought, I always thought it sounded like a good name for a town or something. But
well, and I was wondering whether the new Sowesto places that you're in now, living in southern Ontario, whether there's any towns that you were thinking of when you were constructing the world of Dear Life.
Well, I was probably thinking of some place in Wales or something like that. But now that I'm in Stratford, it has it's a town that's desperately trying to be England. It's sort of got the swans and everything. And I'm sort of at. Yeah, exactly. So I'm at the age where, for whatever reason, I need to be around swans. So, and but I imagine. The town is a fictional town, so it could have been anywhere. It could be somewhere in Germany even, too.
Yeah. Steven Heighton, paradoxically, you have also noted that your night mind, the source of those poems, also forced a kind of paradoxical moment of awakening from a more somnambulant state. And this is to quote you, quit sleepwalking through your short life. In a recent essay, you describe how your night mind, the source of poetry, also sent you to Greece to confront the evolving refugee crisis. How did the idea of disturbing dreams inspire you out into the world?
Well, lately I've been describing Canada as a country locked into a coma of complacency. A word I love compound German nouns. My favorite right now, my absolute favorite is Backpfeifengesicht. Anyone here who's German knows that means a face in need of a fist. And almost every day when I read the news online, I think about the Backpfeifengesicht. But my favorite word absolutely right now is Lebenslüge, which means a life lie. And the idea is that everyone builds their life around a lie, maybe several. And trying to figure out what your own life lie is very interesting and useful. But I think countries also have life lies. In Canada, I think one of our life lies. Maybe the main one is that we're the nice guys. We're not the Americans. We haven't hurt anybody. We're not guilty of any genocides or anything. And I felt that this is the coma of complacency I'm talking about. I saw it in my own life. I saw it in my country's life. And I was getting these disturbing dreams that were provoking poems, and also in this case, made me want to actually do something instead of just screaming at my computer screen or at the TV screen in frustration. So, and it was in fact dreams that made me do it. I got the idea of going, but then I thought it's impractical, it's expensive, I'll have to cancel things. And then that night I had really vivid, powerful dreams that seemed to be saying, do it. And I wish more often decisions could happen in that kind of efficient and commanding manner. So you have it's a emotional commandment. You have to do it.
Liz, in the poem North by South, it's one of my favorite poems in your book, the speaker describes a dream. And this is to quote the lines in the poem. It's evening. I'm to the photograph 3 women who face me, with their babies, bundled in their arms, poet, scientist, Anishinaabe. Smile at me, and one by one, the babies explode into flames. Your poetry also has a provocative power of challenging your reader to explore a host of pressing concerns, from the environmental to the social to the political to colonialism. And often one of the underlying threads is your childhood experience in Northern Ontario. How does poetry, or the poetic register, offer you a novel avenue to approach such challenging questions?
I feel as though it's been, at least from a young age, I felt it was the only avenue that I could really explore my experience and explicate my story through. Because in poetry, there is so much freedom. I mean, there's incredible capacity for containment and form and rigor. And so, of course, I admire it. But also within the medium, insofar as I experienced it from a really young age, there was so much freedom there. And so, when one comes up in life, like in conditions of trauma, let's say, perhaps you don't want to have to express the fullness of it necessarily, but you want to hint at it. You want to have a subtle yet generative medium through which to express your experience without having to be so on the nose about it. And I found poetry was the medium through which I could do that, like, most effectively. In terms of what I read, like, from a young age, and then practicing it and turning my life over to it, I suppose, so far as I've done now.
Gorgeous. I remember a story, and I was asking this earlier tonight. When you won the Griffin, I was listening to an interview you did where you shared a highlight of the experience of that evening. You mentioned the experience of being congratulated by Christopher Dewdney, whose work, as well as his father's work, has inspired your own. Now, of course, when I heard that, my Sowesto antenna went up, because Christopher Dewdney is one of our significant members of the regionalist movement. Could you talk about your personal connections to the Selwyns and their influence of them on your work?
It's really remarkable because, well, my it's like through poetry also, but it's like my partner is also a really good friend with Jonathan Dewdney, who is a nephew of Christopher Dewdney. Christopher Dewdney is a child of Selwyn Dewdney, who was a major he wasn't like even officially like an anthropologist or ethnographer, but he did a lot of work documenting sacred First Nation sites in Northern Ontario, particularly like pictographs. And it turns out the Dewdneys like had like a cottage in this island in this lake in Northern Ontario, Lake Windermere, like not far from where like my own family, like the native First Nations part of my family, when they left the reservation, it's a long story, where they settled. And I was always, even before I knew of all of these connections, I was always really interested in Chris Dewdney's work, you know, because he came through like Coach House Press, which is like a really cool, innovative, awesome press that's been operating for decades and publishing like just awesome stuff consistently for decades.
Amazing.
And I really identified with his work because he combined like kind of like an intellectual rigor with a kind of a spiritual bent and a sexuality as regards the natural worlds and natural history.
And Claire, just as Liz has used the poetic to breathe life into the idea of consciousness, how we experience reality, you've used fiction to explore the imaginary potential of genetic and archaeological science, which is to say, you've used the novel form as a way to tease out elements of the story of human history that science might have trouble telling. And I'm wondering how the novel form for you helped explore the science and maybe even push it a little further.
I would say that there's things when I read about this period in Europe between 40,000 and 50,000 years ago, where there was Neanderthals and Homo sapiens roaming, and that they met and interbred, I wanted to know what happened. I thought, you know, tell me that story. So I started reading the journal articles and anything I could, and what I found was that story wasn't there. Scientists go off DNA samples or bone fragments or bits of chemicals that are left behind in a fire. But as the archaeologist in my novel says, it's the things that don't fossilize that matter the most. So it's what my voice sounds like, what words I said, or who you loved. Those are the things that really make up who a person is. And they're also the things that leave when we die. There's no trace of them. So writing this novel was really a matter of trying to get beyond the science, and I think it's there's so much scientists can tell us, but the more I read, the more I thought it might be the job of a novelist to take the risk of taking the next step and going into the realm of imagination.
And you've challenged a lot of those stories that we think of in terms of the Neanderthal and the image of the Neanderthal. Could you talk just a little bit about some of those conceptions that you wanted to take on?
Well, one of the most fun, actually, is the voice. So we think of Neanderthals as these grunting sort of, you know, but they had a hyoid bone, which is in the neck, and it anchors the tongue, and we have that. And they also had a FOXP2 gene, which we know from the sequenced DNA, and we have that as well. In us, it enables speech and communication. So if you don't have it, those things are hard. And chimps and orangutans, for example, don't have either of those. So it kind of points towards speech. But there's a specialist in England who took a look at the probable shape of their voice box, and said they actually probably have quite high-pitched voices. So the New York Times described this as an excitable Julia Childs, which is a great line. Yeah, are you going to do your Neanderthal? No. I thought we were about to get a... but I love that, because it does go... And she thought they had to force their voices out. So I imagine it sounding kind of like that. but which is complete. There's no trace of that. But I pieced together what I took from the science and kind of went from there.
That's amazing. And so what that suggests is that when we use the Neanderthal term as a pejorative, we should think twice. So, for example, if we were so inclined to call the strange orange man in a big white house a Neanderthal, that wouldn't actually be fair to the Neanderthals. But clearly, what you're pointing out too is that language matters. And Stephen Marche, you've challenged us to rethink the language of gender when we say that men and women, for example, are from different tribes or from different planets. Or to think of metaphors like the battle of the sexes or the gender wars, metaphors that you call disastrous. Nevertheless, you point out that we're in the midst of a revolutionary reevaluation of gender relation. Could you describe this revolutionary moment for us?
Well, I don't think I can describe it because I'm not sure I've completely figured out what it is. I mean, I think one thing that's the past year or two really have really shown me is that my job is really to go out and describe things. You know, I write a lot of things. I write nonfiction, I do podcasts, I do fiction as well. But I really feel like at this moment in history, the time has come to actually just go and look at things as closely as you can. And the act of describing things even in their most basic sense, is a very radical act at the moment, to actually try and get at what the fact of the question is, or what the nature of an intimate, if you actually look at an intimate relationship, like virtually nothing that you're going to read about gender politics is going to explain it, of any kind, of right wing or left wing or of any kind. So like what I feel my job at this point in history is actually try to make things less stupid. You know, like to actually try and look at things and see what they are. Kind of with as little judgment as possible. And that's a very hard task in many ways. But on the other hand, it's very simple. Like I think even like the most basic reporting at this point, like going to America and looking at what's happening or in Canada and seeing what's happening and describing it in the most basic terms is actually quite a radical act right now. So like what I tried to do in my book was actually just to try and describe an intimate relationship in the clearest terms that I could muster. And like without prejudice, and well, actually, to be more clear, like with as little prejudice as I could achieve. And so, like that, I think, and of course, Trump has like made this 50 times. Like I really like I've stopped writing fiction altogether. Like I just go and describe things now, because and I actually try and describe things in the simplest possible terms, because I think that's what we need.
Yeah. In the book, you talk about the invention of a new kind of fatherhood in relationship to this revolution. Could you talk about how the idea of a new fathership has changed your relationship to writing?
I'm actually doing a podcast right now called, and they actually approved this title today. It's with Audible, and it's called How Not to Fuck Up Your Kids Too Bad. And I'm really excited about it. And we go through all the major fatherhood questions one by one. And the thing that I find amazing about writing about this stuff, or I get whatever podcasting is, thinking about this stuff, is that how little it's been thought about. Like how little it sort of exists in this realm of like assumption and half thought. And so if you bring, the beauty of it from a writer's point of view is like, if you bring even a modicum of intelligence to this, you're way ahead of the game. So it's yeah, I mean, I think the new fatherhood is a sort of more conscious, less assumption-driven fatherhood. But on the other hand, I think it's super complicated. And when you know, the interesting questions that we deal with in our lives as men and women are always the specific questions. Like it's very easy to get caught up in op-ed politics and like and generalized cases. But like when you actually look at specific matters, things become very fascinating and very problematic. And I aspire to look at those particularities.
Wonderful. Ron, on the first page of your book, you dedicate your story to your adult children, whom you say you'll forever miss reading bedtime stories to. Storytelling, in this sense, seems like an experience that's intimately bound up with fatherhood. Did becoming a father change your relationship to being a storyteller?
Well, first of all, before I forget, if I was a caveman, I'd be a Neanderthal, because I like to meander. Anyway, that was just too good to just let it lie there. So. No, I always, I was never read to as a kid, but I loved to read. I remember getting House at Pooh Corner on my 7th birthday, and then years later reading that book to my kids, and then finally getting all the jokes that are in. I mean, that went over my head as a kid. Because it was actually a very funny book, But when my kids were small, we lived in a one-bedroom house in Toronto in Little India. And so my kids had the bedroom, they were both in the same room, and my ex and I were on a pull-out couch, for years like that. But it was kind of my favorite time of day when they were in their, pajamas and they're in bed, and you get to read them, whatever it is, Hans Christian Andersen, or I would read Dr. Seuss, or Brothers Grimm even, and because it was great. Because obviously, they don't really want to go to bed yet, so that they just read another one. Very attentive age. But yeah, now like my daughter's 28, my son's 32, so they probably won't even read my book. So so it's definitely something that I miss.
That was actually my next question: is have they read the book, and did they give you feedback on your?
Probably when I'm dead they'll read it or something. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. I mean, it's the same with my music. My music is not their cup of tea. My son likes hip hop, and my daughter likes sort of aggro kind of sort of bands. Lexus on Fire. The most exciting thing I ever did was I sang with Dallas Green once, and I was suddenly cool for a minute, He was one of the singers from Alexis on Fire. But I guess it would be alarming if they were into what I was doing in a way, So, but I miss when they were at that sort of age, the golden age or something.
Yeah. Steven, you have also described fatherhood, how it changed your experience as a writer. While I was reading some of the interviews, you described how the birth of your daughter grounded you as a writer. How was that the case? How did that experience ground you?
Well, first, I'll just mention something I told Claire at dinner once. My daughter, when she was about 12 or 13, was reading my first novel. And I said, "Oh, you're reading my novel?" She said, "Yeah." And so the next day at breakfast, I said, "So, what do you think so far?" She said, "I'm finding it kind of hard to get into." But I have to think that having a child would have the same effect on anyone who, until that time, had been a fairly sort of selfish, bohemian, would-be artist. I had to get more responsible, and I certainly had to get more organized with my time, and that's probably one of the main ways it helped me. Though it also began this path towards a more logistical administrative life that I talked about before, where I had to get really organized. Getting organized is good, you get a lot done, but it means your brain during the day is working in that more rational administrative way. So I mainly have to write fiction to make a living, and so again, that's one of the things that pushed poetry into the night. But on the whole, it's just been, it's the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm one of those people who didn't want to have a child and then did, and now I just think, which raises an interesting question. You think people tell you, do what you want to do. Don't let yourself be pushed into doing something you don't want to do. But what about when something happens that you never wanted and you realize this is really the best thing that could have happened? It makes you wonder about those issues, whether choosing what you think you want is always the best way.
Well, tomorrow and on Sunday, tomorrow, Claire and Steven are going to be in conversation together. I actually talked about Steven's poetry, but tomorrow you're going to have a chance to hear from his new novel. They'll be Saturday. Stephen Marche will tomorrow morning at 10 be in conversation with Ian Brown, who you've heard from tonight, so you will not want to miss coming back to see both of them read from their books and talk a little bit together and fight. Yes, and fight. Liz will be back with us with Tanya Talaga on Sunday, and you can hear her read from her work. And Ron will be with us tomorrow, and just to kind of sneak peek in there, you might play a song or two for us?
They're still on, right? Well, I've been working on a musical. This is insane, but I'm working on a musical based on the book that I've just written.
Amazing.
And so I thought maybe I would play a song from that, maybe, and then read a bit from the book too. Or
So you won't want to miss that. Please join me in thanking our panel.